Good morning. I'm Kelly Boardman, and our reading today is from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 14, verses 13 through 21. It's on page 16 in your New Testament. Feeding the 5,000. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. This is the word of God for the people of God.
I'm going to start off with just a personal story. Happens kind of in this area. Back in the early 90s, before Wendy and I moved overseas, we went camping at Camano Island State Park. We had a lovely campsite near the water, and as evening came, we began setting out our dinner. We were young and poor, so it was nothing elaborate. I might remember it wrong, but I remember bread, peanut butter, and jelly. We both became distracted. I don't know, maybe one of us went back to the car while the other went to get water. I don't remember the details, but I do remember that suddenly we heard a ruckus. We looked over at the picnic table, and there were crows everywhere. They'd knocked over the peanut butter and jelly, they were fighting over slices of bread, and before we got there, one greedy crow just grabbed the whole bag of bread and carried it away. We felt so stupid. What a rookie mistake. But, this is the point here, we realized we could have an even better meal from what the surrounding woods and shoreline had already provided. It's midsummer, we cooked down some nettles, we gathered mussels from the shoreline, and for dessert, we picked fresh blackberries. Okay, it's a small, silly story, but in that moment, it was one of those moments that really felt as though God's hand was right there with us. What we had planned was gone, and yet somehow there was still enough. There's this particular kind of anxiety that settles into us when we look at what's needed and at what we have, and we realize that those 2 numbers don't match. Too many people, too little food, too little time, too little money, too few hands, and we begin calculating. We count what's available, estimate what will be required, and decide what must be cut and who must be turned away. This question, what do we do when there doesn't seem to be enough? It's a question Jesus encounters again and again. And today, we're going to watch how he responds. But just to bring us all up to speed, we're beginning a new series this month called Walking the Way of Jesus. During July, we spent the time asking a foundational question, basically, who are we as a church and who are we as individuals in the church? We were reminded that we belong to God, we belong to one another, we belong to the whole creation that God loves. And from that, we exist not for what we're doing here, but for serving the world. And we also learned last week that even when words fail us, nothing can separate us from God's love. But once we know who we are, there's this other question that follows. How do we actually live that way? And that's where Matthew's gospel comes in. That's why we're jumping to Matthew instead of Romans this month. Matthew will become our guide as we learn what it means to walk alongside Jesus, not simply to believe certain things about him. We will learn to let his way of living and loving reshape our own lives. Now I want to point out, we all know this story today, but we're actually jumping into Matthew right in the middle of two stories which often get separated from one another, but I think they were very intentionally placed together. Today's reading begins with a meal, right? We have this meal at wherever we are. Sometimes it's on a mountain, in Matthew it's not. But before we can appreciate what's happening in this bread and loaves meal, we need to step back and see what had just taken place in the preceding verses of Matthew 14. So if we rewind to verse 1, we read about John the Baptist's death. John had publicly challenged Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee. Herod was Jewish by heritage, but his authority came from Rome. He ruled because Caesar allowed him to rule. And like so many rulers throughout history, his first priority became protecting his own power. So Matthew paints this scene. Herod hosts a banquet in his palace. All the powerful are gathered. Food is abundant, it's luxurious. There's entertainment, and there's this careless promise made. And by the end of the feast, John the Baptist's head is carried into the room on a platter. This is a meal of excess that ends in death. And then Matthew immediately turns our attention onto this other table. In today's reading, starting in verse 13, Jesus has just learned that John the Baptist has been executed. It's hard news. His cousin, his friend, the man who baptized him, dead in such a horrible way. It's news that he needs to mourn. He needs to be grieved. So Jesus, at the beginning of our reading today, it says he withdraws to a deserted place to be alone. But the crowds follow him. And when Jesus sees them, he doesn't do what I would do, which is kind of yell at them to leave him alone for just 1 minute. Instead, we read that he had compassion for them. And from that compassion comes a whole different banquet. Where Herod's feast was born out of fear and the need to protect power, Jesus' feast begins with compassion. The banquet could not look more different from the one at Herod's palace. There's no luxury, there's no privilege, there's no military guard, just a motley group of ordinary people and Jesus in their midst. At Herod's table, the powerful consume while the vulnerable are sacrificed. At Jesus' table, the vulnerable are welcomed and fed. At Herod's table, abundance is hoarded by a few. At Jesus' table, what is available is blessed and shared. At Herod's feast, death is literally served on a platter. At Jesus' feast, bread is placed into empty hands. Matthew sets these meals beside each other and asks us to see the contrast. They show us two kinds of power, two visions of the world, two tables. And the question we are being asked in all of this is, at which table will we take our place? This contrast, it becomes even more significant when we remember the community for whom the Gospel of Matthew was written. You know, we call it Matthew. Church tradition associated this Gospel with Matthew the Apostle, but the author never identifies themselves. Most scholars believe it was written sometime in the mid-70s AD, about 40 years after the events it describes, by an educated Jewish follower of Jesus, writing for a community made up largely of other Jewish followers of Jesus. This is before we started being Christianity. And they lived in a world that was decimated by violence. In the year 70, the Roman armies captured Jerusalem following a brutal siege. The city was crushed, many people were killed, displaced, or enslaved, and the temple, that spiritual center of their lives, was destroyed. And it was more than just a religious building. It stood at the center of worship, of communal identity, of the story they told about themselves. It was understood as the place where God's presence dwelt among the people. Its destruction was devastating, and it raised enormous, even existential questions. Where is God now? Are we all alone? How do we remain faithful? What does faithfulness even mean anymore? What does it mean to be part of Israel without Jerusalem? And different Jewish communities in that time, they answered those questions in different ways. And the movement that would become Rabbinic Judaism centered life increasingly around scripture, teaching, prayer, and the synagogue. Jewish followers of Jesus looked to his teachings, death, and resurrection as the center of their hope. So Matthew, throughout the book of Matthew, it reflects some of those tensions. But we should never mistake this tension between them for the real story. The people were divided, yes, but those divisions were unfolding under the pressure of an empire that ruled through fear, violence, and the protection of its own power. It was Rome that destroyed Jerusalem. It was Rome that destroyed the temple. And it's against that backdrop that Matthew tells the story of a different way of ordering the world, represented by a different table. Matthew's community was asking this new question: how do we follow Jesus in a world like this? And the author answers by telling the story of Jesus. He's writing biography and history, and we like to read it that way, but I wouldn't say that either of those are the primary purpose of this gospel. It was written for a community shaken by loss and uncertainty, inviting them to keep walking the way of Jesus despite everything that had happened to them. And today's reading, the story of the feeding of the 5,000, is meant to show us what that way can look like. And this, I believe, is the exact lens through which Matthew wants his readers to understand this story. Hold on to this, because we'll be in Matthew for the next 4 weeks after this. Twice in his gospel, Jesus quotes the prophet Hosea, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice." Matthew's first readers would have known those words well. They weren't just a memorable saying. They were a key to understanding who Jesus was and what kind of life he was calling them to. For Matthew, faithfulness is not measured first by religious appearances or perfect observance. It begins with hearts transformed by God's compassion. And that transformation becomes visible in lived out lives marked by mercy, justice, and care. So now, we can finally get on with today's actual reading. There's this crowd surrounding Jesus, a big crowd. We call it the feeding of the 5,000. But Matthew tells us that the count included 5,000 men besides the women and children. So the crowd was probably at least twice that size, so half the population of Anacortes. 5 loaves, 2 fish. Imagine being one of the disciples. There was no advanced planning, no catering order. People have just kept coming all day, more and more people. Jesus has been healing them and responding to their needs, but now the sun is about to go down, and the disciples look around, and there's people everywhere. Families, children, older people, people carried there by their friends, people who've traveled a long way. And by the hour, as any crowd does, it's becoming more tired and more hungry. So the disciples begin doing what conscientious leaders do. They assess the situation. They count the remaining daylight. They consider what might go wrong. And perhaps one of them says, we should probably be wrapping this up. And another says, we need to get these people moving before dark. There's no way we can feed them, and they're going to need time to get to where there's food available, and the nearby villages can't even feed 5,000 people. So needs too large, we've got to pull the plug. So they come to Jesus, and they say in as reasonable a voice as they could muster, Jesus, this is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves. It's a reasonable plan. They're not being callous. They really believe this is the most compassionate option. I would dare say most of us would do the same thing. But Jesus responds, they need not go away. And then he adds that line, You give them something to eat. And the disciples are probably struggling not to be frustrated with him at this point, thinking, yeah, Jesus, that's the problem. We don't have enough food to give them. There's a bunch of people, no food. And so trying to be diplomatic, someone states the obvious because Jesus doesn't seem to get a handle on this situation. They say, we have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. The math doesn't work. Okay, this should really sound familiar to us if we think about it. You know, I'd like to help, but I only have so much money. I'd like to serve, but there's only so much time. I'd love to start some new ministry, but there's only so many volunteers. We'd like to address hunger and housing and loneliness and injustice and climate change, but really, those problems are enormous. What can one person or one congregation possibly do? I can't meet this moment. The need is too large, and what I have to offer is totally inadequate. When scarcity becomes the lens through which we see the world, fear begins making our decisions. We become more concerned with protecting what remains than imagining what might be possible. We begin making cuts, deciding who must be sent away, who's in, who's out. But Jesus doesn't back down. He said that they don't need to go away. Bring them you give them something to eat. And you know, he doesn't jump in and perform a miracle right then, right at the start of all this. He gives the disciples a responsibility. Okay, it's a seemingly impossible responsibility, but it's a responsibility nonetheless. Give them something to eat. And all they can see is their lack. Jesus asks what they have, a bit of bread, a couple of fish. There's just no way. I imagine the disciples probably had a lot of impossible moments like this as they wandered the countryside with Jesus, this impractical idealist. And I imagine Jesus, maybe not, he's probably better than me, a lot better than me, not probably. I imagine Jesus gives this next reply with a bit of a sigh and maybe an exasperated rolling of his eyes and says, all right, bring them to me. Jesus doesn't wait until the disciples have enough before inviting them to participate, though. And rather, he begins with what they have. Jesus begins with what we have. The feeding of the multitude, it's the only miracle from Jesus' public ministry that appears in all 4 Gospels. The earliest Christian communities clearly believed this meal was essential to understanding who Jesus was. And why is that? It's because it tells us something fundamental about the way Jesus and Jesus' reign works. He never says, stand back while I solve your problems. He says, you give them something to eat. Bring what you have, and I'll take it from there, don't worry. The disciples don't create this abundance, but they do participate in sharing it. So, this is not a story about discovering that we possess unlimited resources within ourselves, or that through Jesus we have access to every physical thing we could ever want. This is not a prosperity gospel. It's a story about placing our inadequate resources into the hands of Jesus and receiving them back as a calling. So, Jesus takes the wheel and instructs the people to sit on the grass. Okay, Bible translator, here we go. The words we translate as sit down actually carry the sense of reclining for a meal, of taking one's place at the table. Jesus isn't simply organizing a crowd. He's inviting them to become guests at a shared table. It's not a crowd being managed. It's a community being gathered. So Jesus takes the little bit of bread. He blesses it. He breaks it. He gives it to the disciples. And the disciples give it to the crowd. Okay, those actions, taking, blessing, breaking, giving, they'll appear again when Jesus gathers his disciples around the table on the night before his death. Matthew's already inviting us to hear echoes of that meal. Christians, you know, we might think of this whole miracle in different ways. We understand the mechanics of the fish and loaves in different ways, and we kind of obsess on it. Some believe that the fish multiplied physically in Jesus' hands. Others Might suggest that when people saw food being offered freely, those who had brought something began sharing it too. But you might notice that the gospel doesn't spend time explaining how it happened, because that's not the point. We're not supposed to be so preoccupied with the mechanics that we miss the meaning. The important bit is that the bread became enough, and a crowd defined by need became a community gathered around a shared table. What appeared inadequate was blessed. What was blessed was broken. What was broken was shared. And everyone ate until they were full. And after that, the disciples gathered the leftovers, 12 baskets full. At Jesus' table, abundance is not measured by the affluence or luxury of the host. It's measured by whether everyone has been fed. Herod's table looked abundant, but it produced death. Jesus' table began with almost nothing, but everyone received a place. Everyone was fed, and nothing was wasted. And that is the picture of what abundance looks like in the way of Jesus. So now let's imagine being a member of that young Christ-following community for whom this book was originally written, just after the fall of the temple. And they're hearing this read out loud for the first time. Jerusalem has fallen, the temple is gone, Rome still rules, and into that world, the Gospel of Matthew reminds them that Jesus didn't build this community around fear or around what we lack. He gathered people around a table. He asked the disciples to bring whatever they had. He blessed the bread, broke it, and placed it into their hands to share. That community who read or heard this reading for the first time, they didn't possess Rome's wealth or military power. They didn't even have their temple anymore, but they had the story of Jesus. They had one another. And the community had a new calling in Jesus' words. They need not go away. You give them something to eat. Don't become just another version of Herod's palace. Instead, they're invited to become that other table. The table where the vulnerable are welcomed, the table where resources are shared, the table where mercy matters more than status, the table where no one is disposable. Scarcity, we all know it remains one of the defining stories of our culture as well. We're constantly told there's not enough. If we spend time listening for it consciously, we'll hear it everywhere from others and from ourselves. There's not enough wealth, not enough housing, not enough health care or food or security. And the shortages are real. People are going hungry. Families cannot afford housing or medical care. And the story never asks us to deny any of that. Nor does it promise that if we give something to God, God will just reward us back with material success. No one leaves that meal of the loaves and fish with a palace or a lifetime supply of bread. But everyone leaves fed, and there's enough for everyone. Because God's abundance is not a promise that each of us can have everything we desire. It's a vision of a community in which everyone has what they need. It's an important difference. At Herod's table, abundance is concentrated around the powerful, while someone else pays the price. That table, it still exists. We see it whenever people accumulate far more than they need while others are going hungry. We see it whenever food, housing, healthcare, security, or dignity are treated as rewards for the deserving rather than as human needs. Scarcity teaches us to see our neighbors as a threat, as competitors for limited resources. If someone else receives care, there's going to be less for me. If someone else is welcomed, I'm going to matter less. If someone crosses into the circle, perhaps there will no longer be room for those who are already inside. But Jesus shows this other kind of community, a community in which people are not problems to manage, but they are our neighbors to love. A community in which gifts are not hoarded, but shared. A community that asks, what has been placed in our hands? And how might it become part of God's care for others? We don't have unlimited money, energy, or people. Our loaves, our 5 loaves, they're still just 5 loaves. Our 2 fish are still just 2 fish. But Jesus is never concerned about what we don't have. But he does always ask us to bring all that we have. Our time, our building, our relationships, our experience, our compassion, our presence, our voices. None of it may appear sufficient in the face of this world's enormous needs. But Jesus says to the disciples and to us, bring them here to me. The miracle really begins with the willingness to offer what we have, however small it may seem. In a few moments, towards the end of the service, we will gather around Christ's table, where there's a place for each of us. May that meal strengthen us to become that other table in the world, a community where abundance is measured by whether everyone has enough, not by how much a few possess. May we become people who refuse to live by the fear of scarcity. May we become people who offer what we have with trust and generosity. And may our life together proclaim the beautiful truth that in the way of Jesus, abundance does not mean excess for a few. It means enough for everyone. May we live that invitation. Amen.